to Train Your Pegasus by Legion. Read by Ilya Leonov. Chapter 1.
All right, then. Here we are. The conductor opened the door to the train car, and Snowbolt followed him aboard. Won't be too many passengers on this trip, so I think you'll mostly have the car to yourself. There's a bathroom at the rear of the car, and the snack bar is 2 cars ahead of you. Any questions? Snowbolt shook her head and offered the conductor a sad little smile. All right, then. Find a seat, and I'll be around to check on you once we get going. With that, the conductor stepped back off the train and trotted out of sight. With a sigh, Snowbolt took her seat. There were only a few other ponies on her train car, a group of teenagers near the front who were all chatting excitedly to each other. Snowbolt found a seat near the rear of the car, as far from the others as possible. The 10-year-old filly was in no mood for cheerfulness of any kind. Snowbolt looked out the window. It was still early in the morning in Van Hoover. The snow had just started to fall, but a good number of ponies were braving the weather, waiting to wave at their loved ones from the platform as the train departed. Her father, Colebolt, was not among them.
Why would he be? She
thought to herself. The other ponies, they were going to miss their loved ones. They would count the days until they returned, and when the train rolled back into the station, those same ponies would be there to see it arrive. There would be hugs and tearful reunions as soon as the doors opened. It would not be so for Snowbolt. She knew her father would not miss her. In fact, she was sure he was glad to be rid of her. As the train lurched forward, she thought back to that night, only been a week ago, when her father told her she was going to be leaving Van Hoover to go live with her uncle on his rock farm in Dodge Junction. She had been sent home from school again, this time for mouthing off to her teacher. She had sat on the couch, staring at nothing, while her father paced in front of her, yelling and screaming like he always did. "Again, Snowbolt? Again? This is the 2nd time this week. Are you trying to get expelled? Is that what you want?" Snowbolt crossed her arms and looked in the other direction. "Well, what have you to say for yourself?" he asked. Snowbolt muttered under her breath. "Excuse me, what did you say?" Snowbolt turned and glared at him.
"I said I wish it was you who died instead of Mom."
Colebolt stopped in his tracks, looking as if he had just been slapped in the face. He opened his mouth and closed it again. Snowbolt merely stared at him with the same icy glare. There was not even a hint of regret on her face. "Go to your room," Colebolt said softly. Snowbolt obeyed, trotting off to her room with her head high, making a point of slamming the door when she got there. She knew she had hurt his feelings, but she wasn't sorry. She had meant what she said. Colebolt had called her down a few hours later and informed her of his decision to send her to Dodge Junction. She had listened impassively as he delivered the news, then returned to her room to resume her brooding. She may have felt the tiniest twinge of regret then. She wondered for an instant if she had perhaps taken it a step too far this time, but the feeling quickly passed.
Good. If he doesn't want me here, then I don't want to be here either.
Truth be told, Snowbolt liked the idea of living with her relatives on a rock farm even less than she liked the idea of living with her father. She had met them only once or twice at family reunions, and she had never gotten along particularly well with her cousins. She and her mother were the only Pegasi in the family of earth ponies, and Snowbolt had always felt like an outsider. Now, as she sat on the train, she took one last look out the window at the town where she had grown up, the only home she had ever known. The snow began falling harder as the train wound its way up the mountainside, and she got one last look down it before the train entered a tunnel, and the cabin was plunged into darkness. Snowbolt was alone with her thoughts as the train clattered along. She had brought some books for the trip, but she didn't feel like reading. The conductor came by several times to check on her, but Snowbolt politely refused his offer of food and drink each time. 2 hours into the trip, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of boisterous laughter coming from the car ahead of her. She looked up and saw 3 young earth pony colts jostling and pushing their way through the doors that separated the 2 train cars, each of them holding a caramel apple. Snowbolt's heart sank as she recognized the 3 voices.
Oh, no. No, no, no.
The only bright side about Snowbolt's forced relocation was that she was also moving away from 3 particularly troublesome bullies from her school. They were always picking on her, making fun of her legs, or her inability to fly, or her lack of a cutie mark, or anything else they thought would get under her skin.
What are they doing here?
She thought to herself. Snowbolt shrank in her seat, hoping that she might go unnoticed. "Oh, hey!" one of them called. It was the leader of the pack, a big ruddy colt named Rusty Spur. Snowbolt closed her eye for a moment, hoping to make the 3 disappear by sheer power of will. Instead, she felt her seat shake as the 3 of them took the seats across and beside her. "Hey, you slow dolt," Rusty Spur said, a wicked grin spreading across his face. Snowbolt glared at him.
What are you 3 doing here?
Rusty blinked innocently. "Who, us? Why, me and my friends here are going to stay with my family's plantation in Dodge Junction over the winter break." Snowbolt squinted, her eyes closed.
Oh, no. Please, no. Not them. Any pony but them.
Rusty continued. "But what are you doing here, slow dolt? Oh, that's right." In the seats across from her, the other 2 snickered. "Your daddy sent you away because he doesn't want you any more, right?" The other 2 burst into laughter, but Rusty maintained his charade, pouting in mock sympathy. "Oh, yeah, we heard all about that. Every pony at school was talking about it. Tough break, slow dolt." "Yeah, tough break," Rox echoed. The most idiotic of the bunch, Rox rarely did anything but parrot whatever the other 2 said.
That's not what happened,
Snowbolt said, failing to convince even herself. "Well, can you really blame him?" said Smoky Orr, Rusty's right-hoof lackey. "After all, who would want a little cripple like you?" Without thinking, Snowbolt drew her forelegs underneath her body. Deformed from birth, they both turned too far inward. Walking for long distances was difficult for her, and the sound of her hoofsteps had always been conspicuously irregular. At school, these 3 never let her go too long without reminding her of her deformity. "Plus, a Pegasus your age who can't fly?" Rusty shook his head sadly. "Positively shameful."
You can't fly either, numbskull,
Snowbolt retorted. "But I'm not supposed to fly," Rusty said. His voice was patronizing, like a parent explaining something to a foal. "I'm already doing what I'm supposed to be doing. The question is, what are you doing?" "Not flying, that's for sure," Rox chimed in. "She's just a try-fly." The rhyme elicited a burst of laughter from the others. "Don't forget Blank Flank," Smoky said. "Oh, yeah, I almost forgot," Rusty said. "Slow dolt, cripple, Blank Flank, try-fly." The others erupted in laughter and began to chant. "Slow dolt, cripple, Blank Flank, try-fly. Slow dolt, cripple, Blank Flank, try-fly." For Snowbolt it was too much. She burst into tears, pushed her way past the 3, and galloped towards the rear of the train, as fast as her twisted legs would allow. "Hey, slow dolt, where are you going?" Rusty called after her. "Bye-bye, try-fly," called Rox. At the rear of the train car, Snowbolt threw open the doors and ran into the next car, drawing quizzical looks from the other passengers. She kept running until she reached the rear of the train. Throwing open the last door, she was greeted by frigid air and swirling snow. She stepped out onto the platform and draped herself over the rail guards, sobbing uncontrollably. It was just too much, knowing that they would be there at Dodge Junction too, to ridicule her and mock her misfortune every step of the way. It was just one thing too many. It was snowing even harder now, and the sound of Snowbolt's sobs were lost in howling wind and the clattering of the train's wheels. She could not bear the thought of going back to her seat on the train with those bullies, let alone spending winter break with them in Dodge Junction. Snowbolt looked up at the landscape racing past her on all sides. In that instant she made a decision. Without hesitating, Snowbolt lifted the safety chain on one side of the platform and stepped off. For a few dreamy seconds she seemed to float. Then her hooves met roughly with snow-covered earth, and she tumbled head over heels down a steep embankment. Though the snow mostly cushioned her fall, her body and limbs met with at least a few rocks and branches before she came to a stop in deep snow. Head spinning, Snowbolt stared up into the gray winter sky for a moment, watching the snowflakes fall around her. It was only then that she stopped to ponder the consequences of what she had just done. Though her head was still spinning, Snowbolt forced herself to sit up.
"Hey!"
she shouted, waving frantically in the direction the train had gone. Though she could still hear its clattering on the tracks, the train itself was long since out of sight, lost in the swirling snow. It was hopeless, of course. Even without the snow, there wouldn't have been anyone outside the train to hear her. Snowbolt painfully got to her hooves and looked around. The train tracks stretched ahead and behind her until they vanished into the falling snow. To one side there was a dense forest, on the other flat emptiness as far as she could see. She considered her options. She knew that only 2 trains ran between Van Hoover and Dodge Junction per week, so there was no chance of another train coming along any time soon. Walking on the tracks after the train was one option, but by her estimate she was still much closer to Van Hoover than to the first stop along the way. But she had been riding on the train for close to 2 hours before the bullies started harassing her. How long would it take her to walk that distance? Days? Snowbolt looked to her right across the empty plain. She squinted hard, and for just a split second she thought she could see the familiar outline of the hills that bordered Van Hoover to the east. Snowbolt stood there for several moments, looking again and again in all directions, unsure of what to do. None of the options before her looked very promising. Eventually the biting cold of the wind prompted her to move, and she found herself trudging through ankle-deep snow, eastward across the plain, towards the hills that lay beyond. Snowbolt walked at the best pace her twisted legs could manage, still in shock and not entirely grasping the gravity of her situation. Her sadness was gone, replaced for the moment by the single-minded necessity to keep moving, her only defense against the wind's chill. She had scarcely gotten half a mile before she started shivering. She redoubled the pace, hoping the extra exertion would help to stave off the coldness, but it was no use. She could not gallop or even trot through the deep snow, and trying to push through the snow at a faster pace only served to tire her faster. On and on Snowbolt walked. The snow was now nearly up to her flank, and piling up fast, and keeping a good pace was becoming more difficult. Now that the snow was in direct contact with her body, instead of just her hooves and legs, she was shivering uncontrollably. Her legs were so numb that she couldn't feel them at all. But, with no other options available, she pressed on through the wind and snow, not knowing when she would reach her goal, or if there was even a goal within reach at all. Several hours passed this way, though Snowbolt could not say how many. She knew she was approaching the limit of her endurance, but she also thought she had a reason to hope. The ground was slowly starting to slope upwards, and every once in a while the falling snow would clear just enough for her to make out the outline of a row of foothills rising up ahead of her. If she was right, and these were the foothills that bordered Van Hoover to the east, then she was nearly home. The blizzard had now abated, and the pain in her limbs was extraordinary, but Snowbolt forced herself onwards and upwards, climbing the slope with renewed vigor. The snow was deeper on the slope, up to Snowbolt's neck in some places. Every place her coat came in contact with the snow burned like a hot iron, and the pain was enough to make Snowbolt cry out with every step. Up and up and up she went, wheeling herself onward with fierce determination. She told herself that once she reached the top, the walk down would be much easier. Halfway up, Snowbolt began to weep. The full weight of her predicament had finally settled on her, and she wallowed in self-pity. Though she had largely come to grips with her mother's death in the past year, she was now overcome with longing for her. She remembered how her mother used to make hot chocolate for her on cold days like this, when Snowbolt came home from school. She would wrap a blanket around her and sit her by the fire, and ask her about her day. Snowbolt did her best to push these thoughts to the back of her mind and to focus on the task at hoof. She had lost track of time, but thought she ought to be reaching the top of the foothills soon. Every step became a battle as she willed herself to put one hoof in front of the other.
Just a little further. Almost there,
she told herself, repeating it over and over again like a mantra. At long last she felt the slope start to level off, and when she looked up she could see the top of the hill. She did not rejoice, however. She was so tired and so cold that it was all she could do to focus on getting up the last few steps to the top of the hill. At long last, Snowbolt made it to the top. Panting and shivering, she struggled up the last few feet until she saw the ground start to slope downward sharply. She stood there for a few long moments, squinting through the falling snow. But at first she could see nothing. Then, all at once, the wind shifted and her view became clear. She looked down from the foothills, but instead of seeing the earth-pony town of Van Hoover below her, she saw only an empty valley and another foothill rising up on the other side, one of hundreds more just like it, stretching off into the distance as far as the eye could see. Snowbolt's stomach sank.
"Oh, no. No, no, no,"
she said aloud. She looked around in every other direction, but there were no signs of civilization anywhere, only snow-covered hills and plains. She collapsed down into the snow and screamed. She doubted she could take another step, let alone traverse however many more miles separated her from any sort of civilization. And how would she even know she was going in the right direction at all? Snowbolt spent several minutes crying and screaming, the sound of her sobs carried away by the wind, scarcely audible to even herself. After that, a strange calm came over her. Snowbolt lay down in the snow and curled into a ball. Her shivering had stopped, and a sudden tiredness overcame her.
"I'm dying,"
she thought to herself sleepily.
"It's just as well. Nobody will miss me."
Snowbolt closed her eyes and was only dimly aware that the falling snow was covering her tiny body like a blanket. She no longer felt cold, and to her surprise she found that the snow was starting to feel warm and comfortable. Snowbolt remembered the way her mother used to tuck her in at night when she was a little filly, just before she drifted off to sleep.
Yes,
Snowbolt thought.
Sleep. Time to sleep. Maybe Mama will be there when I wake up.
With that one last sleepy thought, Snowbolt closed her eyes, and all was dark.